Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So again, this is a lecture about big data and information security. And we previously talked about the definition of big data. We talked about what is big data. And if you remember last week, we said big data is a set of data that are so large and complex. And then basically they are collected daily from different sources, different locations. For example, we collect data from social media, from shopping sites, from also something like called IoT or Internet of Things that also regularly always collects data, and then also online activities. So that's what is big data. All right, so there are some privacy issues that we're going to discuss when it comes to big data. And if you remember what I said last week, I said if you know people, if you have big data, if you use big data, if you use social media, for example, or use online shopping or things like that, use the internet, there's always a concern about privacy of data, right? The private data, and who's reading it, who knows more about you than the data is being collected by companies like Google, Facebook, and so on. So there are also, we're going to talk about the information security, and next week we're going to be talking about data protection, how certain things, actions you can take to protect your data, right? So basically, we talk about big data is that we now, there's always been data. Companies collect data. Data is like gold now. So where every company collects data to analyze the data and to make decisions and so on and so forth, right? So like I said, you can analyze that data. And by doing that, you have the power to provide insights about people that are far and above what they know about themselves. And there's so many examples of that. And companies, there are many different tools that you can use to analyze the data you have, to make decisions, to advertise, and so on. Who you need to advertise to, who you need to reach out online, and so on. So big data analytics has the power to provide insights, as I said, knowing your location, private information. There are financial benefits that are made from personal information. That's why when you have many of those accounts that you have today are free, because they're not really free, but when you have Google account, Facebook account, and so on, you're not paying for a yearly or monthly subscription, because companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter and so on, they have your data. That's how they monetize it, and that's how they make money out of it, right? So there are consequences, and there are, like I said, there are privacy concerns. Companies like Equifax, for example, they had one of the largest data breaches. They had a lot of information about you and me, and so many other people, over 100 million, I believe over 200 million Americans' data have been leaked. And if you don't know what Equifax is, it's one of those credit monitoring companies that has all those data sets about you and me, and like your date of birth, your social security number, your address, your phone number, and so on and so forth, right? So there is data on everything we have today, and everything is increasingly digitized. So now there are some security threats. So there are different threats, and from like if you work in IT, for example, or you work in security, there are things that you have to kind of study and have to look into. Computer security, for example, protects your network and computer. There is a concept called data loss prevention, and that's a plan that reduces the risks, how to basically try to prevent data from being lost. There are different ways you can do that, like, for example, encrypted data and so on. So even though the data has been leaked, if it's been encrypted, it's kind of hard to kind of make sense of that data. There are different threats coming from like malware, and malware is like stands for malicious software. So any program that intended to do harm, for example, like a spyware, which spies on, if it's an add-on or something like that is installed on your computer, it can actually monitor your activities. And there is something called ransomware, like, encrypts your data. So there are like several sources for threats. Like I said, it could be a physical threat, could be an email, anything like that coming in, any attachment coming to an email, downloads, and things like that. So some of the risks include hacking, For example, hackers anyone who can actually get into your hack into your system or have unauthorized access to your system. You have identity theft. That's basically someone is stealing your identity, knowing, using your social security number, using your name, and so on. There are also, like I said, malware, which stands for malicious software, spam messages, and viruses. And there are like antivirus programs or software that they offer some protection, but they're not really foolproof. They don't really 100% protect your system. So because there are a lot of different ways, like, for example, there is a 0-day attack, which is like a malicious software that the antivirus program doesn't even know about yet. So by having an antivirus on your system doesn't mean that you are fully protected. So you have to do other things, like so you kind of have to use common sense on things like, not downloading from strange sites, not clicking on links and things like that. So there are viruses that actually disable the antivirus program. So that's one of the reasons it's not foolproof. And also the computer security protects your network and computer. Actually, this is actually a repeat of the previous slide. For some reason, I don't know, got repeated. Let's move on. So there are other things that also threat. Like, for example, you have sometimes people ask me, how do I, like, for example, I was asked the other day about there is a spyware called Pegasus, which is basically kind of is designed to spy. It takes advantage of vulnerabilities on, let's say, iPhones and devices like that. If they find vulnerability, then they can actually get into your system. So one of the things I always tell people is just always update your system on a regular basis and things like that. Okay. And then security bypass and things like that. So sometimes people, like, if you ever worked for a company and then they ask you to read the security policy of the organization and agree to it, a lot of times people read it, but they really don't have an idea what that policy is all about. They don't really pay attention to it. They don't follow it. So and sometimes companies also do the same thing. Like they have a policy, but they don't really enforce it. So there are also dangerous links. Like I said, be aware of clicking on links that comes through like social media or comes through sites or emails and things like that. Also, be careful with downloads. Don't just download programs from anywhere. You have to get it from the legitimate source. For example, if you're going to download Microsoft Office, the best bet is to download it from Microsoft's website, for example, right? So you don't want to download that from like a third-party site that you really don't have much information about. And there are also like acceptable use policy. So when you like work for organization and they do have you like read the acceptable use policy, for example, how do you use the company organization, what should you use it for, and so on. So for example, one of the famous things that they tell you is that you can't use your work computer for personal use, like go to Facebook and things like that. So you need to understand that policy and agree to it, and also follow that policy as well. And then you can enforce that stuff through technology. So for example, technology allow you now that you can do things like block certain sites. Like if you don't want people at your company to go to Facebook, you can block Facebook, for example, right? You can block it through certain technology, certain things, firewall, things like that, which you prevent people from using the sites that you want to. And you can even disable certain programs and things like that, like screensaver. You can do it through group policy. If you ever if you ever have experience doing servers work, you can actually do that group policy stuff through there. And there are also anti-spam and anti-phishing programs that you can also implement. For example, like you have Google now has built-in anti-spam, anti-phishing tool that comes in with Google, but there are other third-party tools that you can actually use to do that as well. You can also monitor the bandwidth and filter the contents that comes in through your company network, and also you can audit as well what users do on the company network. You can do the same stuff for yourself too. When you monitor and audit, you can do that on your own machine. So there are certain threats, like I said, hardware failure. If you have data on that hardware device, like a hard drive, and that fails, then you lose the data. So the best thing to do is to back up that data. So that way, if you have a hardware failure, you have a backup somewhere else. For example, I do personally back up my data. Like I have my data on my computer, but I have it on the cloud as well, and then I have it on another drive, hard drive, where I have a copy of the data. So that way, if I ever have a hardware failure, then I have access to my data. Software failures, something similar, and then also certain actions happen by, like, people take certain actions untrained, or people are unexperienced in that regard, where they do certain things and they cause loss of data and a threat to your data or your organization. Also things like penetration, fire, electrical problems, user errors, program changes, telecommunication problems. These are some of the threats. So we'll talk about certain concepts here. We're talking about hacking is a term that is used frequently in the media, and a hacker was once individual you turned to when you had a problem and needed extreme technical expertise. Today, hacker is anyone individual who basically tries to access is not unauthorized person who try to access your computer systems or network, and then get access to your data, and again, because that data is worth a lot, it's valuable information. And as this is a term that I used to use frequently, is a hacking of the systems and computers used by a telephone company to operate its telephone network. Okay, computer security entails methods used to ensure a secure system. You must address authentication and access controls in broad terms for computer security. And then you have network security, which is basically the protection of multiple computers. So if you have, like, in your network or your organization, you have multiple computers, like, for example, they call it the LAN, or local area network. All the computers inside the company inside the organization, from laptops to desktops to servers, they all connect together. That's a network. And security is basically meaning that you are protecting those systems from unauthorized access, protecting the data that is being hosted on those systems. Information security and information assurance. These place focus on the security process of the data. So how to actually make sure the data is being secured. And then assurance refers to the system and information availability. So basically, if you work in security, or they teach you cybersecurity, they teach you something called the CIA triad, which is stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So keeping the data confidential, and keeping the data secure. I mean, integrity of the data basically means nobody's able to exchange the data, right? Do I still have you there, everybody? Just want to make sure. Okay, I do.
Yes.
Okay. Now, cybersecurity is the term used to describe the field covering availability of the system and information when we want them, right? So, so basically, you have all that customer data or anything like that, databases. You want to make sure they are available all the time, and you can do that through different means, like you doing like backups, do redundancy, and so on. There is a term called ComSec, or communications security, which deals with the security of the telecommunication systems. And then cybersecurity is a regular topic in headline news. This led to terms hacking, virus, TCP/IP, encryption, firewall, and casual conversations. So encryption, for example, when you take data that you can read, that you can make sense out of it, like, for example, taking this paragraph here in front of you and then encrypting that data, which basically it doesn't make any sense if you just look at it. You have to have a key to encrypt it and have another key to decrypt it to be able to read that data. So these are some of the early computer viruses. This is an old slide that just talks about prior computer viruses. You can look through that, and for example, the There's one here called the love bug virus, script virus, written in a script programming language, and overwrites JPEG files and MP3 files. And so these are some of the old ones. Okay. You have talked about data control, data quality problems. Here, databases contained garbage characters. And so for postal codes, because employees did not have the correct client address to enter. So when the bank tried to target the particular geographic area to promote a popular Christmas loan, a notable percentage of clients came up with the postal code ho 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 ho, and the bank could not obtain accurate information for mailings. Okay. So there are like here I have the say FBI, a study of the FBI's computerized criminal record system found a total of 54% of the records in the National Crime Information Center systems were inaccurate, ambiguous, or incomplete. The FBI has taken some steps to correct these problems. So again, how do you make sure that that data is being really correct data? So for example, if you have a social media account and you're not really given Facebook or any of the other social media companies your correct name, your location, your correct location, your age, your gender, and so on, how do they confirm that data is accurate? So this is something that that those companies will have to be concerned about. Okay, so you have here the internet client, internet or client server relationship, right? So a client is someone like myself here. I have a computer. I want to go to like a bank website or something like that, or I want to go to Google, then I'm the client and Google is the server, right? They have servers all over the place where they maintain the data on those servers. And if you want to make any connection with that server like Google, then this is the kind of the communication happens between the two systems. This is how usually most of the communication happens. Okay, so how do you maintain that you go into the right website, right server, accessing the right server, and things like that, right? And then you have some general controls here, like software controls, which monitors the use of system software and prevent unauthorized access of software programs, system software and computer programs. System software is an important control area because what it does, it performs overall control functions of the programs that directly process data and data files. And then you have hardware control, which ensures the computer hardware is physically secure, like your memory, for example, on your computer, a check for equipment malfunction, your hard drives and things like that. Computer equipment should be especially protected against fires and extremes of temperature and humidity. That's why, like, if you ever go to like a server room, for example, at any organization, they have to have like air conditioning system, and they have to have make sure the room is not hot, a certain temperature, and so on. And then you have computer operations controls, which oversee the work of the computer department to ensure that the programmed procedures are consistently and correctly applied to the storage and processing of data. They include controls over the setup of computer processing job and computer operations, and then backup and recovery procedures for processing that ends abnormally. And then you have data security controls, which basically ensures that the valuable business data files on either disk or tape are not subject to unauthorized access. So, you have data stored on a hard drive, for example. How do you make sure that that data is not being accessed by someone who is not supposed to access it? So, like I said, there are certain controls, certain implementations, for example, having strong passwords, encryption, and things like that, right? And then you have implementation controls, which basically are the system development process at various points to ensure that the process is properly controlled and managed. And then you have administrative controls, which is a formalized standards, rules, procedures, and control disciplines to ensure that the organization's general and application controls are properly executed and enforced. Now, talking about policies, procedures, standards, and guidelines. What is a policy? A policy is a high-level broad statement of what the organization wants to accomplish, made by management when laying out the organization's position on some issues. So you have IT security policy, you have access control policy, and so on, right? So these are written down basically. What is the policy regarding, for example, in the policy, you can say how often do you change a password, for example, right? How often do the users have to change the password? That's a policy, right? You say, okay, user have to change the password every 90 days or every 60 days or every 120 days and so on, right? That's the policy. And the procedure is a step-by-step instruction on how to implement the policy. So you can write the procedure. If a user forget the password, this is what you do. It's step 1, step 2, step 3. So these basically steps, and then describe exactly how the employees are expected to act in a given situation or accomplish a specific task. For example, a procedure that says, if you get a spam message, this is what you're supposed to do. Forward it to IT, for example, right? So you have to understand the policies and the procedure of organization. And I always advise people, when you work for an organization, take your time to read the policies and the procedures of the company that you work for, and try to understand it. And even if you don't understand it, ask questions about it, and regularly read it and go through it, because it will help you a lot when it comes to protecting the data and things like that. Now you have standards, which is mandatory elements regarding the implementation of a policy. So they are accepted specifications providing specific details on how a policy is to be enforced. And it's possibly externally driven. And the guidelines are the recommendations relating to a policy, right? So these are recommendations. They're not really mandatory steps. Well, what are the guidelines for, let's say, like we talk about COVID today, people say the guideline is to 6 feet when you go into a place, but does anybody enforce that? It's not really like when you walk into a shopping mall, they kind of like the guidelines, this is what you're supposed to do. And so they have some recommendations. And there are 4 steps of the policy life cycle. The first step is called plan, which is you adjust for security, plan for security in your organization. That's the first thing you do. You plan, you have a plan in place. And once you have that plan, you develop the policies, procedures, and guidelines, and then you implement the plans, okay? And then, of course, you're going to have to include, so the step 1 is to plan, and step 2 is to implement the plan or take actions. That's what implement the plans or implement the plan is to take action, which includes an instruction period. And then step 3 is monitor the implementation. So once you plan it, once you implement the plan, and then you have to monitor that implementation, right? So let's say your plan is like, you say, I'm going to, for example, give you an example here. Let's say I'm going to plan to back up the data every 24 hours, right? In the cloud automatically without taking any actions. It's going to automatically do that. Then once you click start, for example, implement the plan, then the next thing you're going to monitor that implementation and make sure that it's working, the data is being backed up. That's monitoring the implementation, which basically ensures that it's effective, your action. And then step 4 is you evaluate the effectiveness. Vulnerability assessment and penetration test. Now, talking about security policy, a high-level statement produced by senior management. The policy itself does not have to be created by one person. It could be by multiple people and be reviewed and edited and so on, right? And the policy outlines the both what security means to the organization and the organization's goals for security. Why are you writing that policy? What is the policy intended to do, right? And then the main security policy broken down into additional policies covering specific topics. So you can, include other policies. For example, in the policy, you can have a section about change management, data policies, like how to maintain the data, where the data has been stored, what users should do when they, let's say, for example, they take take mobile devices and they have data on it. What is the policy regarding that? There might be a policy about bring your own device, like BYOD, for example. Some companies uh, allow users or allow employees to use their own devices for conducting business. But what is the policy towards using your device to use email, to send emails and so on? So there has to be a policy about that. Some organizations, they just say completely forbidden, right? They say we're not allowing you to use your own device for conducting business for the company. You have to have a company device and so on. So it depends on our organization. And there's like human resources policies and so on. Data can be shared for the purpose of processing or storage. You have control over data is a significant issue in third-party relationships. For example, who owns that data, right? So you're sharing a file with another vendor or a third-party vendor. Who owns that data and who has control over it? So talking about data ownership, data requires a data owner, right? So you have a file, who owns the file? So if regularly, if you create a file, you own a file, right? Data ownership roles for all data elements need to be defined in the business. Data ownership is a business function. The requirements for security, privacy, retention, and other business functions must be established. For example, we talk about retention here. Like, for example, some organizations, they require you to keep the data for at least 3 years, or government organizations. So you have to understand what is the regulation. And in a future lecture, we're going to be talking about data laws and regulations. You're required to keep the data for a certain amount of time. Healthcare companies, for example, they might be required to keep the data for 3 years and patient information for about a certain amount of years before they have to discard that data. And also, how are you going to destroy that data? So there has to be policy in place. So not all data requires the same handling. There are data that are not really restricted, or they're not really, it's public data. Some data are private, and then some data are government organizations. They have this concept of like restricted data and so on. Now, unauthorized data sharing. Unauthorized data sharing can be a significant issue. And in today's world, data has a value and is frequently used for a secondary purpose. So ensuring that all parties in the relationship understand the data sharing requirements is an important prerequisite. So when we talk about the GDPR, for example, Global Data Protection Regulation, which is European regulations regarding data, we're going to talk about like this type of relationship and how you can share the data, if you can share the data. So, and then you ensure that all parties understand the security requirements of sharing data is important. Classification of information needed because of different importance or sensitivity. Factors affecting information classification. You have value to organization, age, laws, and or regulations governing protection, right? So there, if you talk about United States, you have a federal regulation and you have state regulations, for example, and then you have in Europe, you have something called GDPR and so on. So here, the government, for example, they have the data as being classified in the United States as confidential, secret, top secret. This is how usually they classify that data. So if it's top secret, only a certain amount of people have access to that data. So and then you have confidential. It's less important than top secret information. And then you have business classifications, something called publicly releasable, and then proprietary, which is owned by a certain company confidential, and for internal use only. Data labeling, handling, and disposal. Data labeling enables an understanding of a level of protection required for data inside an information process system. Protection should be designed into the system, right? So if you have, like, for example, your your operating system that you're using on your computer, they have some kind of design in place that help you with the, for example, built-in encryption and so on, right? Data outside system requires other means of protection. So if you ever like send data to someone, like a file, they call that data in transit, right? So basic data is being moved through the wires and being going through different means to get to the other side. So how you protect that? Training ensures labeling occurs and is used and followed, right? There are important, these are important for users whose roles are impacted by the material, and is also important for proper data handling and disposal as well. And there is something called need to know, which is need to know basis, goes hand in hand with least privilege. So what does that mean, need to know? It means that if you are given access to certain data only based on the needs, if you do not going to need to know that data, or you not need access to a file to do your job, you don't need access to it. That's what need to know is. And guiding factor is that each individual supplied absolute minimum amount of information and privileges needed to perform the work. You don't need more than you need to do the work, right? So if you're not working in HR, you don't need to see the HR salary files, right? This files that has the salary of the employees. That's not something that you need access to. So the policy should spell out these two principles: who in the organization can grant access to information, and then also who can assign privileges to employees. Let's think about data policies. They have the disposal and destruction policy. So important papers should be shredded. So if it has any sensitive data on it, it should be shredded. And some companies now, they don't really do that themselves, but they have like a third-party company that comes in and shred those documents for them, and they give them like a certificate to prove that the data was destroyed. And you can also delete all files or overwrite data on magnetic storage data before discarding them, right? You can wipe the drives, and again, you can also use third-party tool or third-party vendor, and then destroy data magnetically using a strong magnetic field to degauss the media, and then files off magnetic materials from a surface of the hard drive platter. You can also shred floppy media, which is not being used currently anymore, CDs and DVDs. Okay. And the best action here is to just match, the best practice is to match the action to the risk level, right? What happens if, let's say, you throw away a DVD that has some information on it? Is that important information? Is it risky? And so on. Talk about due care and due diligence. Due care generally refers to the standard of care a reasonable person is expected to exercise in all situations. And then due diligence refers to the standard of care a business is expected to exercise in preparation for a business transaction. The standard applied reasonableness is extremely subjective and often is determined by a jury. Many sectors have a set of security best practices. Due process is concerned with the guaranteeing fundamental fairness, justice, and liberty in relationship to individual's legal rights. Individual rights outlined by the Constitution. This is when we talk about United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. You have procedural due process uses concept of fair. Courts recognize series of rights embodied by the Constitution. Organizational due process happens when in administrative actions adversely affecting employees. Incident response policies and procedures. Incident response policies and associated procedures developed to outline how the organization will prepare for security incident and respond to them when they happen. For example, let's say there is let's say there's a flood in a company, an organization. How are you going to respond to that incident, right? Do you send out your employees to a different site that is ready to be available for has internet on it, has computer set up and things like that. So I remember years ago I worked for a company. We had a disaster recovery site where we had a secondary site outside of New York City where if anything happens to the office, then we can go into the other site and then we can do work. So incident response policy, it's a policy just how to basically, how are you going to respond to incident? And that should cover 5 phases. You prepare, that's the first thing you start with, preparation. And then detection, if you detect if any incident happens, like for example, hacking, ransomware, a fire, anything like that. Containment is comes after detection, how you contain it. For example, if there is a hack or is a data breach, how you stop it from, how you contain it. Do you know what steps you take to contain that, and do you unplug the cables, do you take the network down, and so on. And then, and of course, the next one is eradication, which basically means you, let's say, you have a malware or a virus, how you eradicate that virus from the systems. And then after that is basically recovery and follow-up actions. You recover from that, and then you take actions to follow up. How you basically respond to follow-up actions could be things like maybe maybe you can change the server or rebuild the server, or maybe take things off, take things to the cloud, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. Now the next thing is personnel need training with respect to the tasks and expectations to perform complex tasks. This applies to security policy and operational security details. User refresher training for periodic reinforcement. Some companies do like a yearly training or every 6 months and so on, to kind of remind you that things like the security policy of the organization, the BYOD, acceptable use policy, and so on, right? And collection of policies should paint a picture describing the desired security culture of the organization. Security policy, high-level directive. Second level policy is basically dealing with like passwords, access information, how to handle that if somebody have access to information, acceptable use policies, and so on, right? And so now talk about role-based training. Training needs to be targeted to the user with regard to their role in a subject of the training. So someone, for example, who work in HR, they have certain training that covers how to deal with sensitive information, that deals with salary and things like that, hire date and all that stuff. Role-based training is an important part of the information security training. And that applies to the data owner, the person who owns that data, and IT personnel like system administrator, the system owner who owns the system itself, like the server or the computer, the user, and the privileged user and the executive user. I'm talking about user habits, our frontline security tool in engaging the workforce to improve an overall security posture of the organization. How you change your habits. So a lot of times, you work in security, you want to see how the user respond to certain things. Like some companies now do things in the background where basically they try to trick users of the company to click on links and see how they respond to it. So, and then if they do this, they click on it, then they train them on how the best practices. Individual user responsibilities, they vary between organizations and the type of business in which each organization is involved. There are certain very basic responsibilities that our users should be instructed to adopt, right? Your responsibility, for example, is to have a secure or long password and so on, right? Not to share your password with other people. So these are some of the responsibilities. Some of the basic responsibilities is to, for example, you should lock your door to your office, or even lock your computer itself, and do not leave sensitive information inside your car unprotected. For example, people sometimes they leave a laptop with data on it, and that gets stolen and has a lot of data. secure storage media containing sensitive information. So for example, if you have a hard drive, how to, I mean, Windows now, like for example, they allow you to, now they allow you to encrypt your hard drive. And so if someone takes a hard drive out of the system, they cannot plug it into another machine to access the data. It will be encrypted. And then things like shred paper containing organizational information before discarding the data. And do not divulge sensitive information to individuals, including other employees who do not have an authorized need to know it. So do not share the information with them, email it or text it or write it down. Do not discuss sensitive information with family members. The most common violation of this rule occurs in regards to HR information. So as employees, especially, supervisors may complain to their spouse or friend about other employees or about problems that are occurring at work. Other responsibility is to protect laptops and other mobile devices that contain sensitive data. So wherever that device may be, it's a good idea to ensure that the sensitive information is encrypted. Again, I've mentioned this multiple times. And also make sure that the device is on you all the time, right? Don't just step away from that, like go to a restaurant, things like that has data on it. Have strong passwords. And be aware of who around you when discussing sensitive corporate information. Does everybody within earshot have the need to hear this information? So enforce corporate access control procedures. Also, some of the other responsibilities is to be alert and do not allow piggybacking, shoulder surfing, or when you say shoulder surfing is like when you have people standing behind you while using your computer, they can actually look on the monitor and they can see things or access without the proper credentials. Also be aware of the correct procedure to report suspected or actual violations of security policies. That's the last slide. We cover about 41 slides here. I will also be sharing with you a video and a Blackboard, but I wanted to here, give me 1 second. Let's see here.